Sound matters. Be heard. Welcome to the podcast where you get exclusive behind-the-scenes tips to make your own show sound truly spectacular. This is Podtastic Audio.
Hey, what's happening, everybody? How are you doing today? Thank you for listening. I am Chris, and yes, this is Podtastic Audio. You can find me on my other show I do at www.chrisandchristineshow.com. And today, on this episode, I have got a very, very special treat. This is the first time we are doing a guest interview on Podtastic. Our special VIP guest today is another podcaster, but not just any podcaster. I have an award-winning podcaster. What? I didn't know they give out awards. Well, obviously they do. And today, we are going to be talking to Dave Jackson of the School of Podcasting. You can find it at schoolofpodcasting.com, where he teaches you how to get started and grow your potential and your audience with your podcast. And this is all about podcasting. So without further ado, I have for you Dave Jackson, and here's that interview right now. How you doing today, buddy?
I'm doing great. How are you?
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for taking time out today to join us over here on Podtastic Audio.
Yeah, I'm glad to be here and looking forward to having some good conversation.
So, Dave, you've been in podcasting for more than a few years now. Was it like 15 years?
Yeah, it'll be 16 in April.
When did podcasting first become mainstream, you think?
Probably around. That's a good question. I should know my timeline. I want to say 2009. Whenever Apple introduced it into, at the time, it was Apple iTunes. And when that happened, that's one of the few times where I actually saw my downloads kind of do a hockey stick, because it made it, number one, you had this giant company, Apple, announcing, hey, we have podcasts. And then you had all those, Mac people like, what the heck's a podcast? So they went over and clicked on that button. So that was, one of the first times. And then I think probably the big thing later was Serial. Serial was this podcast, kind of a whodunit true crime thing. And I remember because at the time, everywhere I go, at the time I was still teaching, and I had probably 5 people like, hey, you're the podcast guy, right? And they're like, yeah. And they're like, have you heard Serial yet? And I had 5 different people ask me, have you heard Serial? And I'm like, wow, this is really weird. So it just seemed like everybody was talking about that podcast. So that was another one that kind of, that's when I saw it on Saturday Night Live being parodied, I was like, okay, we're getting somewhere, because, when I started, nobody knew what it was. And that's why all the first podcasts were all about technology, because it was the geeks that could figure it out, But over the years, you'd start to hear the word podcast, and usually they would say it and then they would have to explain what it was. And then eventually they quit explaining what it was. And now every news station is like, hey, thanks for joining us tonight. Download our podcast, kind of thing. So it's been fun to watch.
It's funny you mentioned 2009. I believe that was the year that I first heard a podcast, and it was when I got my first iPhone. So I plugged the iPhone into iTunes on the computer, and one of the selections other than music was, of course, podcasting. So I was like, what is this podcasting all about? So I started flipping through some stuff, and I found a podcast that I thought I might like. It was called Tech Stuff. It was under the How Stuff Works umbrella. I think they were Discovery, and maybe they're owned by iHeartRadio now, I think. Anyways, I actually got to talk to, on the other podcast I have, Jonathan Strickland, the host of that podcast. It was kind of a surreal moment to talk to the very first podcaster I ever listened to.
Yeah, it's amazing. I run into that occasionally where somebody will bump into me and they've listened to me, and they'll ask me do you remember when you said this back in 2007? And I'm like, I don't remember what I had for breakfast,
right.
Let alone what I did. So yeah, it's been a fun ride, and I'm trying to see. I actually Googled here, Apple iTunes 4.9 2005. So it wasn't 2009. 2005 they say to 2006, because I was thinking it was shortly after I started, but I thought there was a period there because I remember before there was Twitter, there was a company called Odeo, and they were a kind of like a precursor to Apple iTunes. It was this place where you could go over and you could follow other podcasters and things like that. And when Apple came on board, Odeo shut down. Yahoo had a place for podcasts, or a couple other big directories that just went, oh, Apple's here, never mind. We quit. We're never going to win this battle. And so Odeo shut down, and then they came back with this little thing called Twitter where people could follow each other. So it's always interesting. I would have liked to seen how faster podcast would have grown had Odeo not switched into Twitter, because Twitter kind of stole a lot of the thunder from podcasting.
Well, now the word podcast, I always thought that the word podcast was like Apple thing, like iPod, podcasting, iPod. I thought it was connected.
It is kind of. I mean, that's where it came from, because at the time the iPod had just come out and it was big, and it was kind of cute because it was like podcasting, or not. It was like broadcasting, but it's not as podcasting. So that's where the term came out, and that came out I think in 2004 in a Guardian article, and. But it's not really. For a while, Apple was going after people that used the word pod, and then after about 3 years of that, they kind of quit doing that. And just when they saw Microsoft put the word podcasting in a Zune player, at that point it was just like podcasting was just like Kleenex. It was just something that everybody was adopting to describe this new audio syndication thing.
Well, right now, as it is 2021, why do you think that podcasting is all of a sudden very hot right now?
Well, it's really a couple things. Number one, it's so easy to start one. So there's tons, and consequently, you can find a podcast about anything, whether it's how to breed a chameleon, how to live with herpes, how to date after you've lost your spouse and you're 60. I mean, I've seen so many wide variety of just stuff. You're like, wait, there's a podcast for that? Frisbee golf. I used to joke about, blah, 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 Frisbee golf. And somebody said, you do know there is a Frisbee golf podcast. And I'm like, no. So there's a podcast for everything. And it's a little bit, a lot of people like to compare podcasting to radio. And I really think it's more closer to cable television, because if you think about it, cable television has all these super niche, Animal Planet, the Cooking Channel, racing that's bizarre races you've never heard of, all these kind of bizarre little topics that you just don't see on, kind of mainstream TV, but they know that we can get a smaller but more dedicated audience. I know people that are absolutely, and I mean ginormous fans of the Weather Channel. And I'm like, get out of here. And they're like, dude, I watch the Weather Channel all the time. And I'm like,
right.
All right. So I think that's really what it is. People are finding those shows and they go, oh my gosh, I thought I was the only person that was into this. So you have a smaller number of people listening than a, big broadcast, but the connectivity, like the connect, I can't even come up with a word. Here, I have a new word for this. You ready?
Yeah, good.
Intimacy.
There you go.
I can't remember. I just wrote it down on an envelope here. I can't even remember who told me that. I've done so many interviews, but I'm like, I'm using that word. But that's really what it is. It's instant intimacy. And I mean, I'll give you an example. Haley Radke does a show called Adoptees On. Right. And it's all about people that do, they've been adopted. And I never knew, but people will search for years to find their biological parents and then get rejected again. And I was like, oh, I can't imagine how that would feel. Well, the only people that can identify with that are people that have, walked through those same shoes. And so she has a Facebook group and a community of people that support each other. And again, it's people that like, oh, I thought I was the only person dealing with that. So you go from being alone to, wow, I found my tribe.
That's what I try to tell people too, is that there's a podcast for almost anything that you're probably into, no matter what it is. You can probably find a podcast for it too. You almost can probably find something similar in the YouTube genre too. Now, I was going to say is a lot of people kind of confuse the two a little bit that I try to explain it to them. I try to say it's kind of like Netflix, but for audio, the podcasting. And the people say, well, why don't you just get a YouTube channel? Why don't you just join YouTube? Now, what what would you say to people that try to steer you towards YouTube rather than do podcasting?
Well, on one hand, YouTube is free, but with YouTube, you have to take a shower. And, right now I could not be wearing pants and nobody would know. So that's one thing you need. If you want to do it right, you got to have a little more equipment. Now you need a decent lighting rig, and things like that. So it is free, but if you're in YouTube, the other thing is there is so much more competition on YouTube than there is in podcasting. I would love to know what the ratio is for every one podcast. There's, however many, probably 50 YouTube channels, because it's free and, people just use their phone and they'll just, fire it up and do that. So, you're going to have a lot more competition on YouTube, and it just takes a little more work. And some people just don't want to be on camera. I mean, if you think about it, if I didn't have my picture on my website and I never went to any podcast events, you wouldn't know what I looked like. So that's so you can kind of keep your privacy that way. And I always say to female clients of mine, I go, you might want to come up with a pseudonym. And they're like, oh, really? And I'm like, they'll say, well, like, why? And I go, because guys are creepy.
Oh, that's true. Yeah.
Guys are just creepy. So, and I've known a few people, and I'm trying to figure out what her name is now, because she just started using her real name. Luria Petrucci does Geeks Life, and she is not unattractive, and consequently has had a stalker or two. Because she does video. So it's one of those things where that's another thing to think about. When you do video, you're a little more exposed in a way that may or may not be good. I interviewed a guy from the Darknet Diaries. The guy gets 300,000 downloads per episode of his show, and it's all about hackers and things like that. And in some cases, he's interviewed the companies that were hacked, and in some cases, he's actually interviewing the hackers, which is, again, it's a hyper niche show with information that you can't get anyplace else. And then he does it in a narrative style and puts a lot of production into it. It's an amazing show. But he was saying how he used to do YouTube videos, and his audience, of course, is hackers. And somebody tracked him down. They somehow looked at, he must have been doing something by a window. And so they kind of tracked down what is that land, mass behind him outside the window. And they actually tracked him down to his job, and he just went, oh, okay, that's enough of that. So that's why, you can find pictures of him on the internet because, well, it's the internet. But when he does any kind of publicity or interviews and stuff like that, he gives you a stock image that's basically a cartoon that's just, it could be anybody. It's just a white dude in a hoodie and sunglasses. So that could be anybody. So,
I never thought about it like that, being stalked through your images, like your pictures of you, wherever you do your YouTube channel, I guess, wherever you do it from, that people actually can use the settings around that to kind of figure out where you live.
Yeah, I don't think it's super easy to do that, but it is one of those things. And then the other thing I would say about YouTube is bring an extra set of skin, because you can set up a YouTube account. You can set up a Gmail account. All you need is, 5 minutes to set it up. So I could set up a Gmail account, go over and leave the most scathing comment on your video. And you really can't track me down, who I am and things like that. I mean, of course you can. You can, go knock on the door at Google, but it's not like something where, you can easily create your own little weird persona to go around and be a troll. And there are people on YouTube that you do get a lot more interaction, but you also have people that, for whatever reason, their purpose in life is to come around and just, pee in everybody's Cheerios. And I'm like, well, okay, thank you for the feedback. It's like, all right, I'm sorry you didn't like it, but other people are like, hey, that was great. It was informative and you're funny and blah, blah. And this was like, I thought that mic sounded like crap. All right, well, you're entitled to your opinion, buddy.
Well, one thing I always tell people about the differences between podcasting and YouTube is that go ahead and watch 8 hours of YouTube, and then, or go ahead and listen to 8 hours of a podcast. If you listen to the podcast, you get 8 hours of stuff done. If you watch YouTube, you get nothing done.
Yeah. And that's where I usually tell people, they go, should I do video? And I go, are you doing something that I have to watch you do it?
Oh,
So
right.
is this a cooking show? Is this something where I have to watch you hit a hammer into a nail? Then I want to watch that. But if it's just, you and another person, you're doing an interview show, it's just two talking heads, I don't need to watch that. And if I don't need to watch it, well, then just put it out as audio. It's cheaper. Now granted, YouTube's free, but if you actually, and people now are trying to find places to host YouTube because you have to worry about getting deplatformed and all this other fun stuff, depending on how YouTube's going. So, and the one I found, I forget the name of it, but it was like $60 a month. So hosting a video file is not a cheap thing. So audio is cheaper if you're actually going to pay for your hosting, and it's just a different beast.
So with YouTube and actually getting deplatformed off YouTube, what do people usually do when that happens?
They start a podcast. I mean,
Okay.
Look at Alex Jones. That's a guy that was on TV, and I'm not sure I know he had a YouTube channel, but he still got a podcast, because as long as you have an RSS feed, and that's really all you need. Now, granted, it gets a little harder to subscribe if all you have is an RSS feed and you're not in Apple and you're not in Spotify, because I always use the analogy, if you listen to radio in the car, when you find a station that you like, you make a preset so you don't have to search for it the next time. Well, that's all Apple and Google and Spotify is when you go into those apps and you search for your show, when you click on that, it's just a preset to your feed. So everything that's in your feed will then show up in that app. And so when you remove that, that means now you have to manually tune to that station at least once in your app. So it's not as easy. It's very 2005. That's how we used to do it back then. But you can still reach your audience. You just have to now spend a lot more time on your website explaining, okay, here's how you subscribe to the podcast now that I'm not in any platform that you've ever heard of. So it'd be a little different. But as long as if you have an RSS feed, you're still in business.
So you couldn't ever I know if YouTube kicks you off and you say you have an RSS feed and say are there certain things that you should try to stay away from that may get you banned from, say, Apple and things like that?
Well, yeah, I can't say I want to kill all the blank, blank, blank. I can't, it's kind of the stuff that's just like, well, duh. So I don't want to do hate speech. I don't want to tell people, I don't want to incite violence, things like that. I don't want to give out, government secrets. Just read their terms of service. Most of them are, pretty obvious. It's like, yeah, I can't say, oh, I hate this type of people, everybody should go kill them. Or I hate that politician, somebody should shoot her in the head, or whatever. You can't say that. That's. I always say there's freedom of speech, but there's also, there are these things called consequences. So you have to be careful with that. So, and for the most part, unless you're talking about the big three, which of course is religion, politics, and abortion, if you're not talking about those, there's a really good chance you're not going to have any issues. It's when people get into politics and abortion and religion, because everybody has an opinion on that. And I always say it's kind of interesting. If we just look at religion, I always wonder, because it's usually, in some cases, it's somebody spouting their opinion and how this is wrong and you shouldn't do this and that. And I'm like, do you really think you're converting anybody with that? And likewise with a political show, when they're like, oh, the Democrats are this and oh, the Republicans are that. I'm like, do you really think that there was somebody who was a Democrat that at the end of your podcast went, you know what, I'm voting Republican next time, or vice versa? It's like, so, but those are the things that we're passionate about in some cases, and that's what people want to talk about. And if that's the case, go right at it. Just realize that there's a good chance that 50% of your audience is really going to disagree with you. So it is what it is.
So if somebody was going to start a podcast, right, from scratch, what are some of the things that they probably should know to do or work on?
Well, first thing, you have to ask yourself why. Why am I starting a podcast? Because if you can't explain your why, you're never going to make it through the how. And so that might be, I want to be seen as an expert. I want to promote my business. It might be, I just want to have fun. I want to talk about Batman with my cousin. That's fine. But the other thing you have to keep in mind, things like your audio. And I know you've talked about that in past episodes about how to get great audio with cheap equipment. You got to put a little bit of effort into that to make sure that you sound good. Because if 1 minute you're super loud and the next minute I can't hear what you're saying, or if there's I sound like I recorded in the bathroom or things like that, take some steps to kind of deliver decent audio. I just watched a presentation on YouTube, and the host of this kind of webinar was using the built-in laptop mic of whatever computer they had. And so they were probably, I don't know, 2.5 to 3 feet away, because it was on a desk and they were standing up, and they just sounded like they were in a bathroom, and I had to really kind of strain to understand what they were saying because there was so much echo. And then the person they introduced had a headset on and was clear as a bell. And it's just like, wow, that's going to drive your audience nuts. When I remember once I was listening to Mark Maron interview Michael J. Fox. Now, Michael J. Fox, for the record, has Parkinson's, and he can't keep still. That's a physical ailment. But he was also, so he said they had given up him using a microphone, and he was just using the laptop microphone. And I adore Michael J. Fox, but I was also listening to this podcast in the shower. And so Mark introduces it, and I'm getting ready for a shower, and I hear Michael J. Fox and whatever. And I kind of have to strain to hear him, but I'm like, okay. And then I get in the shower, and the speaker is literally right by my head. And when Mark speaks, I can hear him plain as day. And when Michael J. Fox comes on and there's just a little bit of room noise and a little bit of echo, I could hear him, but he might as well have been just going, wow. I just couldn't understand a word he was saying. So, and you have to remember, in some cases, this is being heard in a car where you've got the sound of the tires on the road, and if you got the windows down and people honking and, whatever else is going on. A car can be, on one hand, it's a great place to record because they do their best to keep the sound out. But, it's when you're driving, you got the sound of the engine. There is a bit of background noise. And so it used to drive me nuts. I know Audible purposely has the volume of their audiobooks a little lower than a podcast. And there were times if you had somebody that recorded an audiobook and it was even more quieter, I couldn't hear it. I was like, well, I guess I'll have to wait till I get somewhere where I can, either throw on my earbuds or just turn off the car so I can hear what's going on. So,
well, why do you think that some of the newer podcasts, the ones that I've heard, like the ones that start out, they have a hard time figuring out the audio? Why is that?
I think sometimes, well, in some cases, they've just got bad advice. There is unfortunately, very popular microphone called the Blue Yeti.
I've heard of it.
Yeah, and I don't know who said it first, but I think in some cases you have lazy journalism. So they're like, oh, I have to do a story on a podcast mic. So they went up to Google, and they just Googled podcast mic, and there was somebody talking about a Blue Yeti. And yes, you can plug it directly into a computer, but it also has multiple settings. So you can have it set up to pick up just what's in front of it, or what's in front and back, or front, back, and both sides. So it'll pick up in every direction. And unfortunately, a lot of people have that mic set up to pick up in every direction. Then I always advise my clients to be about 3 fingers away from the microphone. You want to be fairly close. And in the case of the Blue Yeti, it looks like it's meant to be set on a desk. So it's now 2.5 feet away from you. Plus, if you happen to tap your desk, it's going to sound like there's an earthquake, and you sound like you're, underwater in a bathroom. So I think in some cases, people either I just plug this in and I'm good to go. And, we don't read the manual. Why would you read the manual?
Right.
And in the manual, it says, do not do this. And that's the other one. You talk into, it's weird. The front of that microphone is actually the side of the microphone. It looks like you should talk right into the top of it. And I have so many pictures of people using this microphone improperly. So I think that's one of it. You just didn't read the manual in some cases. And then things like they don't know to get fairly close to the microphone. So they have it sitting on their desk, and they lean back in their chair, and now they're a good 2.5 feet away. And, it's just like, that's not going to be, you need to learn a little mic technique.
Right. I think a lot of people too, also, I think they obviously don't record with any headphones on. They just put the microphone down, and wherever it is, they figure the microphone is in the room, so it's going to hear me okay. And so I just hit save and send it off. It's good to go.
Yeah, and then the other one is your environment. I got hired to record a bunch of people at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. I live in Ohio. I'm about an hour south of that. And so I go up there, and I've got all my microphones, and I've got this recorder and a mixer and all this other stuff and all these, microphones. And they go, oh, we're going to be recording in the conference room. And I'm like, okay. So I walk down the hall. I go into the conference room, and number one, it looks like a cathedral. I don't know how tall the ceiling was, but it was not your typical ceiling. It was way, way tall. and then they had kind of like, it was almost like a church, like half the ceiling was a skylight, which let in all this light. It was a beautiful room, and they had this big wooden table, but I had this big giant echo chamber basically. And
right,
so,
of course.
Yeah. And so I had people, kind of separated a little bit so that you wouldn't get a bunch of bleed into the microphones where, person A is heard on person B's microphone. And I was listening through it, and I just, before we even recorded, I was just like, oh, this is a horrible environment. And they did have carpet on the floor, which is always a bonus. But other than that, it was just a big, large table, some chairs, and a bunch of glass with a really tall ceiling. And I was like, this would be a great place to sing, but not a great place to talk. And so what I ended up doing is I was sitting there, and I had this mixer, and each channel had a mute button. And luckily, it was very choreographed. You had one dedicated host, and she would say, Mr. So-and-so, how do you feel about such and such? And everybody would just listen to Mr. So-and-so. So what I was doing is I had everybody's mic muted, and I knew when she was going to talk, so I would unmute her, and then she would direct her question as so-and-so. And it wasn't like a round table. Nobody was interrupting anybody, but I was sitting there watching, almost like playing a piano, just to see who was going to talk so I could unmute them. And by doing that, it got some of the echoous, the echo, the room reverb out of the recording, because at the time I didn't have the capability to record separate tracks. So it was one recording, and I was trying to remove as much echo from the recording as I could. So that was interesting and stressful, to say the least.
I bet it was. So Dave, you have the School of Podcasting. When did you first start the School of Podcasting?
Back in 2005, I had started podcasting in April, and I'm going to say it took me about 3 months because, again, people were just asking me, hey, wait, first of all, nobody knew what a podcast was, but you would find the occasional person that would listen to one, and they're like, well, how did you start to do that? And so at the time, I heard two things. I heard memberships are going to be the next big thing, and a friend of mine had come back from a conference and said, hey, podcasting's going to be the next big thing. And I was like, huh. And I'd seen so many internet ideas come and go, and I would always kind of think, oh, I should do something like that. And then I wouldn't, because you'd run into imposter syndrome or whatever, and I wouldn't take any action. And I just read it over and over again. Membership sites are going to be big. And then my friends like podcasting is going to be big. And I was like, you know what? I should start a membership site about podcasting. And I was like, you know what? I'm going to do it this time. If it doesn't work, who cares? I'm going to try this. And so I just started putting together as I learned, because back then I was still kind of learning, and anything I learned I would put into the School of Podcasting. And there actually came a point where I had too much information in there to where people were like, can you just, because it was like I had basically created a buffet. It's like, here's everything you need to know. And then people were like, can you just, like, where's the microphone stuff? So I had to kind of go back and reorganize it over the years and things like that. And I basically have come up with kind of two tracks. One for like, okay, I really have to worry about the budget, and that's fine. I've been there, done that. And then here's like the medium budget. So, and then I have the budget is no, like, I've got my dad's credit card, I can buy whatever I want kind of path. So, and if it doesn't fit into those three, and then I basically find the best thing. Like I could say, here's 7 microphones for under $100, but I'm like, how about if we narrow that down to 3? Because again, if you just give people too much information, then they can't decide. They get paralysis by analysis. So it's been fun over the years because I go through, in fact, I'm doing it right now. I'm wrapping it up. I go through every year, and I go through every single course, because when I got to equipment, I was like, wait a minute, I don't recommend this stuff anymore, because I had all sorts of mixers and things of this nature. And I was like, yep, that's got to get updated. This needs updated. Things of that nature. So it's fun because it's an always changing kind of field, because technology just keeps getting better and better, and things are getting smaller and smaller and cheaper, which is even better.
Right. Like the PodTrack P4, is it?
Yeah, that's the one I recommend to almost everyone if they're just getting into it. I said, because it really is kind of a Swiss Army knife. If I've got multiple people, and let's pretend there's no COVID, and I want to do a round table, I can plug 4 microphones in. If I want to connect to somebody on Zoom or something and record that interview, I can connect via USB. If I have somebody who's like, I don't know anything about this technology, can I call you on the phone? I can plug my phone into the unit, and actually have that phone. And what's great is they do have separate tracks. So if I have somebody who's, on their phone, but the background, they've got a bunch of wind noise or something like that, I can actually just mute their channel without affecting the whole recording. So it really is an amazing piece of gear. And, 7 years ago, that would have been $1,000, and now it's $200.
Right. I have one personally, and it's in the box and it's still sitting in the cupboard. I haven't had a chance to use it yet. We bought it in case we were like on the road and we were going to do like a podcast, but not in here. And that's what I bought it for. And I was going to use it. We were out of town, was it about a month ago? And I brought it with us. So we never actually used it. But I have it.
The cool thing about it is, like, right now, if you used it to connect, because right now we're using CleanFeed. If you had connected via USB using the P4, and for whatever reason, CleanFeed ate your file, normally you're like, oh, and you have to do what I call the call of shame. So you call me back up, Dave. It's a great interview. Can we do it again? Yeah. But if you were using the P4, you could record it, and that way I always try to have at least two things going, because it never fails. The more important the guest, or the better the interview, the better the chance that somehow technology is not going to be your friend.
Right. Always back up if you can. I always try to back up after I'm done doing an interview or even doing a show. I always back up to another drive. I got 2 more drives that I back everything up to immediately, just in case the computer crashes. Because my computer I'm using, I kid you not, I bought this computer brand new in 2013.
Yeah.
That's how old it is, but it's
that's
still
a million in computer years. Yes,
it is. It's still working though, so I can't complain. I was going to buy a new one, but I'm like, I don't know. Should I? I don't know. It had pretty good stats for a computer back in the day. I think it had like 12 gigs of RAM and like 2 terabyte hard drive built into the thing. So I'm like, it's pretty good stats. I mean, I would think so. I kept it.
Yeah. Well, that's it. I had the church I go to, they had a machine that was, and I'm not making this up, Windows, I think it was there Windows 98? Yeah, there was 95 and then 98. They were running Windows 98, and I walked in and I was like, oh man, I felt like I was in like the Smithsonian. And I said, I haven't seen this in so long. And then I thought about it. They used that computer to make the bulletin. That's it. They do run Microsoft. That was it. And I mean, I think there might be a directory with addresses and stuff, but for the most part, they check email and do the bulletin. And I was like, well, you can do that with Windows 98. Their problem was the printer went bad, and they were trying to connect a printer to Windows 98. And as you might imagine, a printer you buy today is not really designed to connect to Windows 98.
Wow. Well, I bet.
So if you got an old computer and it's doing what you need it to do, if it ain't broke, don't fix it.
The only problem I have, I guess it's the fan for the thing. It's been so noisy lately. It's like humming, like it's just spinning along. I don't know if it's just overworked or what it's doing, but it's just been real loud.
It's letting you know. It's saying, hey, getting old. You might want to start putting some money away.
Well, that's the thing. I keep looking at computers and I say, well, these ones only have 1 terabyte of hard drive. This one had 2. I'm like, what do I do with the extra space I got? I guess I got to buy an external hard drive. So
that's it. And those are getting cheaper. I mean, they're not cheap, but you can get huge amounts of space again that, 5 years ago would have been, $500-$600. And now you go down to Office Max and it's, $99, $79, and you're like, wait, for 2 terabytes of space? Yep. I'm like, wow, it's amazing.
Yeah, it is amazing. So you on the School of Podcasting, you help new podcasters get started and launch their podcast, right? So
I helped them launch, and then I also have people. I had 2 people join this month that already have a podcast, and they're just like, okay, how do I grow this thing? So it's one of those things. It's kind of a marketing problem I have. Is everybody sees me as the launch guy, and I'm like, I'm also kind of the grow guy. I help people monetize. So it's. I'm actually thinking that I might actually launch. I have to think about this really long and hard. I might launch a second membership site to compete with myself. And
really?
And that one will be all about just growing your podcast. Because I can't, my perception in like the public is Dave is the launch guy. And the book, I have the book, and so people are starting to go, oh, that guy can probably help you monetize too. But for whatever reason, and look, I could have many worse things said about me if you want to think of me as the podcast launch guy. I love to help people launch, but there's definitely more to the School of Podcasting than that. And I just thought, maybe I need to just start something that's blatantly, here's how to grow your podcast to help kind of boost that knowledge that, oh, yeah, Dave can help you do that as well.
I was one of the first guys to buy your book, by the way, the new one, the Profit from Your Podcast book. I do have it sitting right over there.
Thank you, sir.
I did read most of it, when I had a chance to. So I was looking at all your ideas about how to make money with a podcast, which is funny because when we started the other podcast, making money was like something we never really thought of. We do make money on it now, not very much. I mean, it's only maybe $2 an episode, but hey, it's something. But it's just something we never really thought about doing. We did it for fun and things like that. So when you have new people come to the School of Podcasting, are what are the things they really want to do? Is it about making money or having fun?
Both. That's one of my first questions. And I finally had to really come out and just be blatant about it, because I would say like, well, what's the goal of the podcast? And they'd be like, oh, I just want to help people. And, I want to get the message out, or I just want to have fun. And I'm like, great. So I would go through and then they'd be like, well, I'm not making any money at this. And I'm like, well, wait, I thought the goal was to get the word out and to have fun. So now I just say, is this a hobby or a business? And they'll which is my way of saying, are you doing this for fun? Or are you kind of trying to make some money with this? Because there are different paths you kind of go down depending on what it is. There are a lot of people that started as, I just want to have fun and do this. And then all of a sudden a bunch of people showed up and then they go, now that I have a crowd, how can I monetize? And that's really the way you want to do it. I see so many people that start off with their sole goal of, I want to make money and I want to make money now. And I'm like, okay, step one is get an audience. And they're like, great, but how do I make money? And I'm like, no, step one is get an audience. Let's focus on that and find out what they want. So it's a little bit of both. And there are plenty of people that at times I've seen in different forums where they're like, oh my God, does everybody have to make money? Like, I'm just doing it because, I want to talk about, movies from the 80s and I don't care if I make a dime. I mean, and it is one of those things that can be just a fun hobby. I mean, I love to ride my bike in the summer. I haven't made a dime on that. I used to do photography. I never made any money with that. So you don't have to make money with your podcast. It's just one of those things that you have, in some cases a problem when you get people like Joe Rogan getting paid $100 million. People are like, wait a minute, you can make money with this thing? And I'm like, well, first things first, you're not Joe Rogan. His career started in 1989. So, come see me about making money in 15 years if you want to make $100 million. But you can, it's possible. And it's like anything else. I always say, because people go, well, can you make a living with this? And I go, can you make a living as a musician? Maybe. An athlete? Maybe. An actor? Maybe. A writer? Maybe. It takes a lot of time and a lot of effort and a lot of dedication. So I'm not saying you can. I'm just saying it's not easy. And that's where I actually made an episode a couple years ago, and I wish I would have made it 15 years ago, that said, if you are coming to me and you're going to say, I want to quit my job in 6 weeks, I'm not your podcast consultant. I go, there will be other people who will, have you spend 3 easy payments of $300 to take your money. I'm just here to tell you, you can open up a Wendy's today and not make money for, 6 weeks, because you've got to get the word out. There's marketing, there's consistency, value, all sorts of fun things. But it's a fun balance, but it's a little bit of both, though. I mean, to go back to your original question, some people come in, they're like, hey, I've been doing this now for 3 years. Can you help me monetize it? And I'm like, yes, we can definitely look at that. And then there are other people, they're like, oh, I just love talking about whatever the topic is. And there's no right or wrong answer there. If I know for me, one of my hobbies is playing the guitar. And one of the things I absolutely hate doing, even though I'm a teacher, is teaching the guitar. Like, I can teach technology all day long, but if I get somebody that wants me to teach them how to play the guitar, for whatever reason, that just takes all the fun out of my hobby. And I was like, because it just, again, what they want to do, they want to pick up a guitar and play, Stairway to Heaven. I'm like, well, first we have to learn the chords.
Right.
So, so it's one of those things that you don't have to make money with your podcast. And in some cases, that can kind of rob the fun out of it.
Yeah, I was going to say, so if you're doing your podcast as a hobby, fun thing to do, and then it becomes where you start making some money, not a lot, but start making some money on it, does your whole attitude towards the podcast change?
Sure. You have different, let's say you do sponsorships, which, for the record, is not the best way to make money with your podcast. The best way is to come up with a product or service that meets the needs of your audience. Sponsorship is cool, but you have to have really big numbers if you want to make a sizable chunk of that. And the problem is, when you do that, let's say you grow your audience and you get some sponsors and they say, great, we're going to sponsor your show for the next 3 months and you publish every week. Well, guess what? You are now under contract to put out an episode every week for the next 12 weeks. And, granted, if grandma dies or something like that, you can reach out to the sponsor and go, hey, we're not going to put any episode out this week because my grandma died, and we will still give you your full 12 episodes. There's just not one this week kind of thing. And they may or may not, be cool with that. Right. So that's something you have to think about when it comes to any kind of sponsorship and things like that. And then there's more work. They're going to want to know, how are you going to track that? Is it some sort of code that people use, or is there a link that they have to go to? And then there's going to be reports. You have to let them know that, hey, thanks so much. Here's how many downloads this episode got. You can hear your ad. It's at the 3-minute and 15-minute mark. So you're doing more work. It's not one of those things where it's like, I'm just going to kick back and do my podcast and get paid. It's like, right. Well, and you're going to do this and you're going to do that. And in some cases, you're going to wait a month or two to get paid, depending on how it's set up. So it's a whole other aspect. And
it's like a job, like another job.
Yeah. Well, that's the guy I was talking about before from the Darknet Diaries. And he said, the more popular he got and he started doing advertising, and he's like, it's kind of stressful now. He's like, he goes, the minute I put out an episode, he goes, I got to start kind of working on the next one because, time is not stopping. So depending on the scenario. Now, if you love the podcast and you love the topic and you just love digging in even deeper, that stuff doesn't bother you. But if it's just a hobby thing and all of a sudden you're like, oh, now I'm making money, but now I've got to do it, it can kind of rob some of the fun of it.
So in podcasting, new podcasters that start out, one term you seem to always hear about is the term pod fading. Mm-hmm. And why does that happen? And it doesn't usually happen on the 7 episode, or episode 7?
Yeah, I'm getting ready to do that. I started a podcast called New to Cooking because I know I should be cooking more. I definitely eat out less than I used to, but I thought I'm going to start making my own stuff because it would be healthier. It's probably cheaper, and I should just start cooking. So I thought, you know what I'll do? I'll start a podcast about this, and it'll be what I call a journey podcast, where I'm not the expert. I'm not telling you how to cook. I'm telling you, I don't know how to cook. And every week I always say you'll either end up with a great recipe or a great story, one of the two. So I started it, and I think I'm at about, 8 or 9 episodes. And it's just dawned on me. The reason I don't cook is I don't enjoy cooking. I just don't. It's, and I've got enough things that I can make. I do fish, I do burgers, I do steak occasionally, I can bake a potato, I'm good to go. I've got enough things that, I eat salads, I grill chicken. I've got enough food to eat that I'm okay. And I'm a kind of a picky eater. And it was just like, you know what? This isn't really my passion. And that's really when I started. I wasn't like, I'm going to learn how to cook. I love to learn new things. And it's just like, wow, this takes up a lot of time. And I just made like turkey cupcakes, and they were okay, but okay, and it was like, all right, and then I would have to and the other thing is the dishes. Oh my God, they're out of control. Right. Because you gotta mix it in this bowl and then put it in that bowl and that bowl. And it's like, and I just was like, oh, I remember now. This is why I don't cook. I'm not that, I like what I like and I eat what I eat. I don't really need to learn a new dish. So, and it just dawned on me the other day, I haven't put out an episode in about a month and a half, if not longer. And I was like, you know what, we need to kill that one. So, and I kind of joke when people say, well, what's the one thing you should think about when you start a podcast? And I go, that's easy. What are you not going to do anymore? Because it takes up time. So it wasn't enough that it was taking me time to learn how to cook, but then I'd have to turn around and basically do a report on it. And I was like, okay, this is just chewing up too much time. And it just wasn't my passion. The passion wasn't there. And when the reward of cooking your own stuff outweighs the pain of learning to go through that learning curve, then it's worth it. But I was kind of like, you know what? The results were meh. Okay. All right. That was kind of neat. It was different. It's a flavor I hadn't had yet. But the pain I had to go through to get there, I was like, yeah, I don't think this is working. It's not a big enough payout. So, and I think that's what happens sometimes is people think it'd be fun. You just talk into a microphone for 15 minutes and you're good to go. And you're like, well, you had to figure out what you're going to say. Then you had to record it and you probably should do some editing. And then you had to upload it. And then you need to write a paragraph about it. And like, wait, I just want to talk into the microphone.
Right.
And that's where they go, this is more work than I thought. And so the payoff of hearing their voice and the fact that they got, 7 downloads on that first episode isn't a big enough payoff for the learning curve. And so consequently they quit.
Right.
I have an episode right now I'm doing a test on, and I have 9 episodes out. And I just wanted to see, and I'm in almost every platform aside from, I think, Pandora, but anything that's out there, I'm in. I just wanted to see how many downloads would I get. I have 9 episodes out, and I have a whopping 22 downloads.
Wow.
Total.
You quitting your job yet or what?
Not yet, but yeah, I just was like, I hadn't done that in a while. And so many people think like, man, if I could just get an Apple, all those people are going to find me. And the next thing you know, I'm going to be, America's next top podcaster. And it's like, really, Apple is a giant phone book. And for those of us that remember phone books, it's a great way to be found, but it doesn't make you famous. You have to have people, think about what a phone book was, is somebody would come in like, oh, I need a plumber. And then somebody would say, oh, you need to call, Dave's Plumbing or whatever. And you'd go to the phone book and you'd look up Dave's Plumbing because it was alphabetical and it made it easy to find him. But it was usually somebody else going, oh, use my guy, Dr. So-and-so. He's, blah, blah, blah. And then you looked him up. So it's an easy way to get found, but you still have to have people talking about you to inspire somebody to open up the phone book and look for you.
Well, speaking of downloads, what do you think is like the average for like the average basic, indie podcast, what the numbers usually should be around?
This is a number that will, this is another reason why people quit is because we'll put downloads just to the side for a second. Let's compare it to running. So I come in, Chris and I are talking, and he's like, Dave, man, you're all sweaty and stuff. I'm like, yeah, I just ran a mile. It took me 9 minutes. And I go, is that any good? And Chris goes, I don't know. How old are you, Dave? And I'm like, I'm turning 56 next week. He's like, all right. And like, are you like, what kind of shape are you in? I'm about 25 pounds overweight. He's like, okay, well, for 25 pounds overweight, 50-year-old white dude, 9 minutes isn't that bad. But if I say I'm a 22-year-old Olympic athlete,
right.
9 minutes is horrendous.
Right.
So when somebody says, hey, I got 130 downloads, is that good? Well, number one, that's 6 classrooms of 20 and 10 people waiting in the hall. And when I used to be a teacher, that was basically the whole hallway. That was half a building for me. So never forget that. Those are people that are listening. And so if 130 downloads of a weight loss show, I'm going to be pretty disappointed with that because there are a lot of fat people that can be listening to that. But if I'm doing a show about pygmy ponies and I get 130 downloads, I'm ecstatic because that is a hyper niche show. So it really kind of depends. And I always just say the equation for downloads is the total value in the episode multiplied by smart marketing, smart promotion. So this isn't where you go into a Facebook group for NASCAR and start talking about, hey, everybody should listen to my show about jazz. They're like, what? Smart marketing. And because if you don't have any value, it doesn't matter how much you promote it. It's really not going to grow that much. If you have tons of value, but you don't tell anybody about it, it's not going to grow very much. So you have to have great value and you have to have decent promotion. You have to go out and tell people, then that's the number of downloads you get.
Well, Dave,
but right now to give you a number, I think right now the median is around 150 and the average is around 1,700.
1,700 for what, the month?
Per episode.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
So like right now I'm getting, as I look at this, my brand new show, I am getting about 6 downloads on the one episode. So yeah, and that's why you get this, because you're like, how can that be so low? There were 4,000 podcasts added yesterday, not episodes, podcast. 4,000 shows launched yesterday.
Wow.
So those shows have very small numbers, right? Those are the people that are getting 18 downloads if you count your cousins, kind of thing. So consequently, that number gets dragged way down. And then, so that's why because you're like, well, that's not that many people. Well, again, 1,500 people, that's, we're talking 40, 50 classrooms, something like that. It's a lot. So, and that's why you have to kind of stick with it. But even if it was just 50, that is 2 classrooms of people.
Right.
That in an age of AM, FM, satellite radio, Netflix, Hulu, HBO Max, Disney, Xbox, there are so many things they could be watching, and they're choosing to listen to you.
Right. So you have to kind of appreciate that.
Yeah. And that's where we go back to one of the questions you asked. I said, you have to know why you're doing this, because I've seen people that have been ecstatic. They'd be like, I'm getting 300 downloads an episode. I can't believe this. I thought nobody was going to listen to me. This is amazing. And then somebody will go into a Facebook group and go, we just went over 1 million downloads, and it just deflates them.
It does, doesn't it?
Yeah. So don't compare your numbers to anybody else. Just keep focusing on your audience and going back to your why. If your why is, let's say you're doing this and you have a business. Oh, okay. Well, is it bringing in more customers? Yes. Well, then do we care how many downloads you get? You're successful. It's doing what you want. I know years ago, I had a set of 4 brothers and they loved Formula One racing. And they got together and started talking about Formula One racing. They really didn't care how many downloads they got. What it was a cool excuse to tell their families, hey, can you guys watch the kids? It's time for me to go record the podcast. And it was a bunch of brothers. And it was just their way to, it was kind of a virtual man cave where they could just get together like they used to when they were kids and talk about Formula One. It was almost like therapy to them. They could care less how many people are listening. So again, it kind of goes back to, is this a hobby or a business? And if it's a hobby, then, if the numbers are going up, great. But if they're not, have fun and enjoy it.
Didn't you also say 3 years is usually what it takes to build a decent audience?
Yeah. Anytime when I go through and I look at people, it always seems like, oh yeah, we started it and then the first year was awful and then we did this and all of a sudden it's like, and then by year 3, we were starting to actually make some money. And it's one of those things like, when you buy a blue Volkswagen, like on the way home, it seems like every other car is a blue Volkswagen. And I heard that at an event, and it was funny because that's about how long it took me to really start making money with my first book. And also the School of Podcasting took a while to take off. And we're at an event. I was in Utah, and it was a panel on monetization. And so like true podcasters, we're sitting in the back, passing notes and talking about it. And somebody asked, how many years does it take to, make money with your podcast? And I was sitting next to my friend. I said, watch, he's going to say 3 years. And the guy's like, well, really to make money that made a dent, it was about 3 years. And ever since then, I've just now noticed that. And when I hear people talk about it, and if it's less than that, it's because they had an audience already built in. Because going back to the guy from the Darknet Diaries, it took him much less time, but he also already had a website that was getting 20,000 visitors a month. And I'm like, okay, that explains
that
some
helps.
of that.
It does help that out and stuff. So what do you think about the celebrities that start a podcast and they already have their built-in audience, and they kind of people just assume that they're going to have these massive numbers, but those start to fade out too eventually if their show isn't very good?
That's it. It's got to be good. I think my favorite was Andrew Dice Clay did a podcast, and it was just him and some, sidekick guy. And so there's a lot of what I call the curse of knowledge, where they're telling a lot of stories, but they're both laughing because they have the knowledge of all the behind the scenes stuff. Well, the audience didn't. And it was weird. And Andrew thought he was also on the radio. So about every 10 minutes, he would do a reset. And I was like, it's, you hit play. It's not like I joined the podcast in the middle, but he'd be like, and you're listening to the Dice Man. And it's like, okay, Amy Schumer got paid a ton of cash to do a podcast on Spotify. And I don't know if you heard it, but it was awful.
No,
and
I haven't heard it. No.
Oh, it was bad. It was just a case where, hey, we got hired because we're famous and funny. But I always want to go, if you think about it, comedians, they test their data. Like they test those jokes on smaller clubs. There's a lot of, it's not like they're just going out there winging off stuff off the top of their head. That finished stand-up has been honed and polished for, months in some cases. And this was not. This was just, we're just going to turn it on and we're witty and funny, and it's two girls and a guy, and we're going to do double entendre and kind of stuff but it was just like, okay, this is obvious that you've put no thought into this. And so that didn't work. Kathy Lee Gifford had a podcast years ago that didn't work. You still got to deliver content. You just can't say, well, here I am. And I run into that. I work for a podcast media hosting company, and I've had people that they'll send in a ticket and they'd be like, there's something wrong with your system. And I'm like, why? And they're like, I'm only getting X amount of downloads. And I'm like, okay, well, like, why? Is somebody trying to listen and it's not working? They're like, no, but like I have, 30,000 followers on Twitter. I've got to be getting more downloads than this. And so it's a very polite, like, don't you know who I am? And it's like, yeah, right. That's, it's a different thing. It's not everybody on Twitter listens to podcasts. So it's a little tricky.
It is.
You've got to, in the end, you've got to know who your audience is, find out what they want, and then deliver it to them. And the tricky part, because starting a podcast isn't hard. I could burp into my phone right now, and it would be an Apple next week. It's a matter of who is my audience, why am I doing this podcast, and then if I do have some sort of goal, what can I talk about that's going to hold their attention while helping me achieve my goal? And
Perfect.
That's the part. And that's the part where you go, oh, that takes a little thought. I'm like, so starting a podcast isn't hard. Starting a good podcast takes a little effort.
It sure does. Well, Dave, this has been very informative. It's been so much fun having you on the podcast today. I really, really appreciate your time today.
Oh, dude, thank you so much. This is, when people say, would you come on my show and talk about podcasting? And I'm like, well, you don't really have to twist my arm that hard. So
not at all. Love to. So, Dave, where can our listeners find you?
Yeah, go over to schoolofpodcasting.com. Everything you need there. You can contact me there. You can download 700 plus episodes. If you want to join, there's a button there for that as well. But it's all over at schoolofpodcasting.com.
Well, thank you, Dave. Thanks for coming on today.
Thank you.